Hi everyone, welcome to this talk. Today I'm going to talk about the colonization of Mars, and I will propose a philosophical study of it. Before I start, it should be noted that in the last few years, the colonization of Mars or planet or the moon has been a lot discussed in the media, and we have seen a lot of new companies being involved in space exploration. And so this is really interesting to discuss the colonization of Mars because we are today before the whole process or before the actual colonization of that planet. And so what I'm going to do here is evaluate, analyze, propose the different scenarios of development that I have anticipated. So different scenarios of development of the colonization of Mars and propose an ethical study of it. Before I really start, it should be noted that whether or not the arguments that I will defend here apply to space exploration will not be discussed here, because it could be defended that exploration of a planet or exploration and colonization are pretty much the same thing, being different only in a matter of degree, but not in nature. So in the subject of the Mars colonization, I work on the assumption that the whole problem is not a question of human right, in which case we would approach the subject from in the framework of the deontological ethics. Instead, I think that utilitarianism is the most relevant theory to analyze the subject. So just before I start, a quick reminder about utilitarianism, even though I guess most of you already know what it is, but just a reminder. Utilitarianism is a moral theory, a consequentialist moral theory, which means that following that theory, according to that theory, an act is not moral, an act does not have intrinsic moral value, in which case that would be in the deontological ethics, but instead only the consequences of that act have a moral value. And so the specificity of utilitarianism is that an act is good only if its consequences maximize the good for the greatest number of people. So in other words, the theory of utilitarianism asks us, given a certain situation, what action will maximize the good for the most. So before discussing the scenarios of development of the Mars colonization, there are a few points that should be discussed. First of all, it is that in that utilitarianism, we will be in a classical anthrocentric ethics framework. That means that only humans can be moral agents, and this is a very important point in our calculation of the maximization of good when we study the scenarios. Given that we should maximize the good for the most humans, another point is that we should take into account the future generations. The reason is, if we want to maximize the good for the most people, future generations count as humans and so should be taken into account in our calculations, in our utilitarianist calculation. Another point is the notion of good. So in the literature, there has been different notions, different definitions. For instance, from a hedonist point of view, maximization of good concerns maximization of pleasure for humans. But in that case, as the colonization of Mars concerns the future, I think that even if we just take into account the very next generation, we don't know what their good or what their well-being will be. And so my definition of good in that discussion will be the satisfaction of preferences. That is, the good for future humans will not be their pleasure, but the width of the range of actions available to them, the potential actions that they can do or not do. So now, what are the available options, the available scenarios of development? Well, I have identified three main scenarios which we will discuss and argue for and against. The first one is one which I called free exploitation. So in that scenario, the colonization or exploitation of Mars is not or poorly legislated, leaving a lot of room for private companies, such as SpaceX, for instance, or any other. And so in that scenario, in a few decades or centuries, there are humans on Mars, villages, exploitations by companies of, I don't know, resources on the planet, a political system is put in place, etc., etc. And so, if we want to evaluate what quantity of good this scenario will bring to humans and our generations and future generations, it's actually very difficult, considering the range of options available to them, because it's pretty clear that there will be good consequences for humans. That is for sure. But in the calculation, we also need to evaluate how much bad it will bring. And in that case, there are counter-arguments against that scenario. The first one is that this scenario would force future generations in a certain path, a path in which Mars is exploited, used. And if we consider their range of options, it's also very clear that for instance, they will not have the possibility to leave Mars untouched. That is, there is no turning back after the exploitation of Mars. So they will not have the freedom to leave it as it is, or to exploit it another way, or to avoid potentially harmful consequences of our acts of companies on the planet. So that is the first counter-argument that says that it will not bring as much good as we could think to humanity. The second one is an argument that is a problem, rather, that is encountered in archaeology as well. That is, of course, we want to exploit Mars, maybe, and use some of its resources, but we risk to damage the planet too much. And in that case, future generations who might develop other technologies, better technologies, that is, less harmful, less destructive, more efficient technologies, then if we damage the planet too much, we will leave too few room for maneuver for them. And so they will not be able to do the action they want to do or they need to do in their future. So the previous scenario seems hard to defend as the best one, the one that would maximize the good for the most humans. So how about we take the opposing view and imagine a scenario in which we would fully protect the planet. This scenario I have called the maximal conservation. And so we leave future generations with the widest range of options, because they can either leave Mars as it is, or exploit it for scientific purposes, or for private companies, whatever they want to do or need to do. And furthermore, we can even use the financial resources today that are used for scientific outer space expeditions and use it for the sustainable development, which as well could be defended as an action that would bring more good to the most humans. But one could argue that in that case, we might be omitting the potential goods brought by scientific expeditions, because we also need knowledge from outer space, knowledge from planets. Well, whether or not knowledge counts as a good consequence on humans is another philosophical question, which I will not tackle here. But anyway, I think that we can defend a maybe less restrictive legislation that would allow for some expeditions probably non-human expeditions with robots, or maybe some human expeditions, but not too much, of course, and with the purpose of leaving Mars as it is and using it and exploiting it the less possible. And so in that scenario, the goods brought by the actions of humans stems from the preservation of the potential actions for future generations. So against the previous scenario, one could argue that a strict protection of Mars wouldn't leave future generations with the widest range of options. And the reason is, colonizing a planet such as Mars takes a lot of time, at least years or decades. And so if eventually future generations need to go on Mars and to do whatever thing they need to do, send humans, use resources, and need to do it in an emergency, they will be unable to do so because the planet will not be prepared, as it will be left as it is. And so this could bring more bad to humans than expected. So I advocate for another scenario, a scenario in which the legislation would allow enough actions to anticipate the needs of the future generations and prepare the planet if they need to exploit it some way or another, but would restrict their actions and our actions in order to protect the planet and not cause harmful actions. Of course, this is a difficult point because we need to determine to what extent the legislation should allow or forbid human actions. What are the risks? What are the consequences? How to evaluate the consequences? Are there thresholds that shouldn't be exceeded? For instance, in terms of the number of humans that should be present on the planet in order to protect it. These are questions that are difficult to answer, and it's very difficult to evaluate the risks of such actions. We are in the case of unknown unknowns, and in that case, it could be judicious to use the precautionary principle. So, what is the precautionary principle? Well, that principle says that in the absence of scientific evidence of certain risks for certain action, we should not act. In other words, the absence of a scientific evidence does not count as a justification, an argument to perform a certain action. And the purpose of the precautionary principle is to act with precaution, and so to evaluate the risks for which we have a suspicion and propose a consequentialist calculation with probabilities of the risk and then to choose a certain action. So in the case of the Mars colonization, the precautionary principle would tell us to do the least actions possible and certainly to avoid actions for which we are unable to anticipate the outcome and the potential harm for the planet. So for instance, a legislation that follows the precautionary principle would determine certain places that could be exploited by companies, others by scientists, others only by non-human things like robots, and a lot of other places that shouldn't be touched by humans or by whatever thing, and so leave left untouched. So this is what the precautionary principle would say. And in such a scenario, with a limited colonization of Mars, with a legislation that follows the precautionary principle, we are in an option where we avoid the problems of the free exploitation scenario. So will leave future generations with a somehow wide range of options, because with the precautionary principle, we try to leave Mars as it is and take the less risks possible. And so we avoid harmful exploitation or risky actions. And on the other hand, we leave future generations with the options of, for instance, leaving Mars the way it is and almost untouched, or to exploit it Mars as they need to do or want to do. And so that scenario counters the problems of the two first scenarios I have presented, and this is why I advocate this one, because to me, and following that defense, a legislation of Mars with the precautionary principle and the limited colonization would leave future generations with the widest range of options, as they will have a planet that could be ready to be exploited or used or just left. And on the other hand, they will have the widest range of options to do what they need to do. And so this is the scenario I defend. So of course, there are a lot of things that could be discussed, so we can discuss that together in the discussion. But well, thank you for your attention.